Ever had an organization, a committee, a self-appointed king of a little plastic castle try to tell you what you could or couldn't do on your very own land? Land that's been in your family for generations? I have. The Clearview Estates Homeowners Association, helmed by a man whose ego was considerably larger than his actual domain, decided to fine me for hunting on my own property. Their reasoning was a masterclass in pretzel logic and entitlement. So I took a rather definitive step to correct their misunderstanding. I bought the extensive woodland tract they all use for their idyllic weekend hikes, the one they implicitly advertised as a community amenity, and I closed it permanently. It was, shall we say, an education for everyone involved. Where are all of you watching from today? And more importantly, have you ever had one of those run-ins with an HOA or any other petty bureaucracy that just made your blood boil? Let me know down in the comments. I'd be genuinely interested to hear your stories, because I know I can't be the only one. My name is Arthur Vance, and the land in question, a sprawling few hundred acres of forest, field, and stream known locally as Vance Woods, have been passed down through my family since the late 1800s. My great-grandfather had cleared the first fields, my grandfather had replanted timber after a bad fire in the 40s, and my father, bless his soul, had simply loved it. He taught me to hunt there, not for sport as much as for connection to the land, to our history, to the quiet rhythm of the seasons. After a long career in financial analysis, a field that demanded precision and a rather dispassionate view of tangled affairs, I come back to the old homestead. My father had passed a year prior, leaving the house and the woods to me. My wife, Eleanor, had been gone for 3 years before that, and the silence of the old house was sometimes a comfort, sometimes a hollow echo. I wasn't looking for complexity. I was looking for the solace of familiar trees and the murmur of the creek that cut through the back 40. Clearview Estates was a relatively new development, a collection of oversized houses on undersized lots that had sprung up on what used to be Old Man Hemlock's dairy farm, bordering the eastern edge of Vance Woods. Its president, a florid-faced man named Bartholomew Cromwell, seemed to believe his jurisdiction extended wherever his gaze fell. I'd seen him once before at the local hardware store, holding court near the plumbing fixtures, loudly complaining about the quality of modern copper piping compared to the good old days, despite looking like a man who had never personally sweated a joint in his life. He had an air of perpetual, low-grade indignation, the kind that thrives in small ponds where it can declare itself a leviathan. The inciting incident, the spark that lit the long fuse, happened on a crisp October morning. I was out in the deep woods, a good mile from any Clearview property line, on a deer stand my father had built decades ago. It was well within my rights, well within hunting season, and I was, as always, meticulously careful. I took a clean shot, down a respectable buck, and was in the process of field dressing it when I heard the approaching voices. Not the quiet passage of fellow hunters, but the strident, oblivious chatter of recreational hikers. Soon enough, 2 couples, clad in expensive athletic wear, emerged from a barely discernible game trail that led, I knew, towards the unofficial network of paths crisscrossing a large, undeveloped parcel of land that lay between my property and the main Clearview development. They saw me, saw the deer, and their expressions shifted from surprise to vaguely horrified. I nodded politely. They scurried past, whispering furiously. I thought little of it, beyond a fleeting annoyance at their intrusion into a normally silent part of the woods. 2 days later, an official-looking envelope arrived. Clearview Estates Homeowners Association was embossed on the flap. Inside, a letter signed by Bartholomew Cromwell, president, informed me that I'd been fined $500 for discharging a firearm in proximity to Clearview Estates residential areas and engaging in activities, to wit, the butchering of wildlife, that create a nuisance condition and negatively impact the aesthetic and recreational enjoyment of the community common areas. It further demanded I cease and desist all such hunting activities immediately. The arrogance was breathtaking. Their common areas? The woods where I stood were mine. The land they were hiking on to get that glimpse of me, that wasn't theirs either. My initial reaction was a cold, knot forming in my stomach. Not fear, but a profound sense of insult. This wasn't just a fine. It was a territorial claim, an attempt to usurp my rights, to dictate how I lived on land that bore my family's name and history. Aesthetic enjoyment? Nuisance condition? The words felt like grit in my teeth. My father would have had a conniption. Eleanor, with her quiet strength, would have advised calm, methodical action. I decided to honor them both. The years I'd spent unraveling complex financial structures for corporations, tracing assets, and navigating labyrinths of contractual obligations hadn't entirely left me. The skills were dormant, perhaps, but not gone. I pulled out my property deeds, the thick, vellum-like paper crinkling reassuringly. The boundaries were clear, surveyed, and recorded meticulously. Then, I turned my attention to Clearview Estates. Their plat maps were public record. As I suspected, the extensive network of hiking trails they so valued, the ones their residents used daily, the ones that led to the spot where they'd encountered me, were not on HOA land. They snaked through a large, privately owned tract of approximately 150 acres of mature woodland belonging to a Formulating Timberlands LLC, a corporation whose address was a post office box in another state. I took a walk the next day, not on my land, but along the periphery of this Formulating parcel. Sure enough, there were Clearview Estate signs, Clearview Community Trail, dawn to dusk, please keep our trails clean. Your HOA, they'd even installed little wooden benches at scenic overlooks and put down gravel in a few muddy spots. They were acting as if they owned it, or at least had an official easement. But my preliminary search of county records showed no such easement recorded for the benefit of Clearview Estates on the Formulating land. They were in essence trespassing and encouraging their residents to do the same, all while having the gall to fine me for activities on my own, entirely separate property. The hypocrisy was staggering. My first call was to Mrs. Eleanor Gable, a woman whose family had lived in the valley even longer than mine. At 87, she was sharp as a tack, with a memory for local history that was legendary. Arthur Vance, as I live and breathe, she chirped over the phone. What mischief are you getting into, young man? I explained the situation with the fine and Cromwell. She cackled. Bartholomew Cromwell. That pompous gasbag. Thinks he bought the whole county when he bought that little patch Hemlock sold off. Formulating Timberlands, you say? Oh yes, I remember when they bought that. Some out-of-state investment group. Hardly ever hear a peep from them. Old man Hemlock used to let folks wander through there, but he never gave away any rights, mind you. Cromwell's just taken liberties, like he always does. She then gave me the name of a former Clearview HOA board member, a Mr. Henderson, who had apparently resigned in disgust over Cromwell's dictatorial ways. Mr. Henderson, when I finally reached him, was initially cautious but soon opened up. Cromwell runs that HOA like his personal fiefdom, he confirmed. He pushes through what he wants, bullies anyone who disagrees. Those trails? He started improving them with HOA funds a few years back. Said it improved property values. No one questioned the ownership too closely. It was just assumed we had permission or it was public land. He's very good at creating convenient assumptions. Henderson even managed to find an old digital copy of the HOA's covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CC and RS, and emailed it to me. As expected, they were a litany of petty rules for Clearview residents, with no mention of any authority outside their own platted development. My next stop was Sarah Jenkins, a young, bright lawyer in the county seat whose small practice was gaining a reputation for taking on and winning tough cases. I laid out the documents. My deed, the Clearview plat, the Formulating Timberlands ownership record, the fine, Henderson's testimony, and photos of the HOA signs on Formulating land. Sarah listened intently, her expression growing more focused with each detail. Mr. Vance, she said, a small smile playing on her lips when I finished. This is audacious, even for an HOA. They're fining you for conduct on your land, based on rules that don't apply to you, citing disruption to common areas they don't legally control and appear to be trespassing on themselves. It's a beautiful trifecta of overreach. So, what's my best course of action? I asked. Beyond telling Cromwell to go pound sand, which I'm sorely tempted to do. Oh, we'll do that. Metaphorically speaking, Sarah said. We'll send a very polite, very firm letter refuting the fine and pointing out their, shall we say, presumptuous use of the Forest Stream property. But you mentioned something else earlier when you were describing your financial background. You said Forest Stream Timberlands LLC had a P.O. box address. Yes, I confirmed. Often a sign of an absentee owner or a holding company trying to minimize contact. Exactly, Sarah mused. These kinds underscore out-of-state holding companies, especially if they're not actively logging or developing, sometimes view such parcels as non-performing assets. They might be amenable to an offer. A new thought began to crystallize, a strategic possibility that went far beyond simply refuting a fine. You think I could buy it? I asked, the idea taking root. The Forest Stream land? Sarah leaned back. It's a thought. It would certainly solve the trail access issue definitively. And it would be a rather elegant countermove to Mr. Cromwell's aggression. It would require due diligence, of course. Finding the real people behind the LLC, assessing the land's fair market value, making a discreet inquiry. The more I considered it, the more appealing it became. It wasn't just about stopping the fines or the harassment. It was about drawing a clear, undeniable line. It was about reclaiming the quiet enjoyment, not just of my land, but of the entire surrounding environment, free from Cromwell's encroaching sense of entitlement. This was no longer just about a $500 fine. This was about principle played out on a much larger chessboard. While Sarah began the delicate process of researching Forest Stream Timberlands LLC and its principles, Cromwell, predictably, escalated. My polite but firm letter, drafted by Sarah, which pointed out that I was on my own land and that Clearview Estates had no jurisdiction, and which also gently questioned their authority over the trails they were so fond of, was met with another, more belligerent missive. This one, dripping with condescension, accused me of antisocial behavior, endangering the community, and willful disregard for neighborly conventions, threatened further fines, legal action, and reporting my activities to county authorities. He was, it seemed, completely incapable of considering he might be in the wrong. His arrogance was a shield, deflecting any inconvenient truths. Mrs. Gable called a few days later. Arthur, that Cromwell fella held a special community meeting last night. Ranting and raving about you, apparently. Said you were a menace, trying to destroy their way of life. Stirring up the hornets, he is. Let him stir, I said, a cold resolve settling deeper. He's making my case for me. His overconfidence, I thought, will be his undoing. The investigation into Forest Stream Timberlands LLC was slow but steady. Sarah, with her sharp legal mind, and I, with my experience in untangling deliberately opaque financial entities, made a good team. It turned out the LLC was a subsidiary of a larger, diversified investment firm based in Chicago. They'd acquired the land as part of a larger portfolio years ago, and as Sarah suspected, it was largely forgotten, a line item on a spreadsheet, probably slightly underperforming, if anything. We drafted a careful letter of inquiry, not revealing my identity initially, just expressing interest from a local conservation-minded buyer in acquiring the parcel. The initial response was non-committal, but they didn't say no. That was enough. I started liquidating some long-term investments. This was going to cost a fair bit, but the price of peace and the quiet satisfaction of Cromwell's eventual comeuppance seemed increasingly worth it. Meanwhile, Cromwell, emboldened by his own rhetoric and the apparent silence from my end beyond the initial letter, grew bolder. New, more permanent-looking metal signs appeared on the Forest Stream trails. Welcome to Clearview Nature Preserve, maintained by your HOA. He even had a small wooden bridge built by an HOA-hired contractor over a gully on the property. He was spending HOA dues, good money after bad, on land he had absolutely no claim to. Sarah and I documented everything meticulously, dated photographs, copies of invoices we managed to obtain through a sympathetic contact Henderson still had within the Clearview administrative office. Cromwell was, quite literally, building our case against his own misuse of authority and funds. The stakes felt higher now. It wasn't just a financial investment. Cromwell's campaign of vilification was having a minor effect. I found a couple of my no trespassing signs along my actual property line defaced. Someone had thrown trash over my fence into one of my pastures. Nothing major, but it was a sign of the pettiness he was capable of inspiring. I installed a few discreet game cameras, not just for wildlife anymore. The negotiations for the Forest Ream parcel were delicate. The investment firm was, as we'd hoped, looking to divest some non-core assets. My offer, slightly above a timber assessment I'd commissioned, but likely fair for a quick, uncomplicated sale, was accepted. We structured the purchase through a newly formed LLC under Sarah's firm's name to keep my involvement hidden until the last possible moment. The closing date was set for the first Friday of November. As the day approached, Cromwell, blissfully unaware, announced the first annual Clearview Estates Fall Foliage Fun Run and Community Picnic, heavily promoting the beautifully maintained Clearview Nature Preserve trails. The flyers were glossy, featuring happy families frolicking on the very land that was about to become mine. The irony was almost too perfect. Sarah and I decided this would be the ideal moment for the reveal. The Friday of the closing arrived. The papers were signed, the funds transferred. The 150 acres of woodland, the beloved Clearview Nature Preserve, now belonged to Vance Heritage Holdings LLC, of which I was the sole member. That afternoon, Sarah, a hired surveyor, and I, along with 2 local workmen I trusted, drove to all the access points of what was now my land. We started at the main trailhead, where Cromwell had erected a particularly ostentatious carved wooden sign. The workmen, with crowbars and a sledgehammer, made short work of it. In its place, we installed large, professionally printed aluminum signs. Private property. In no trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted. Vance Heritage Holdings LLC, we did the same at every other entry point, stringing thick, highly visible nylon rope between trees where paths were less defined. We replaced the little bridge with a sturdy, locked gate. It took several hours, but by late afternoon, the former Clearview Nature Preserve was unequivocally and visibly closed. The next morning, a Saturday, was the day of Cromwell's Fall Foliage Fun Run. I was up early, sitting on my porch with a cup of coffee, the crisp autumn air carrying the distant sounds of excited chatter and the occasional blast of a starter pistol from the Clearview Clubhouse, where the run was supposed to begin before heading onto the trails. I didn't have to wait long. Around 9:30, a car door slammed down the road, followed by an agitated male voice. Then another. Soon, a small convoy of vehicles was parked haphazardly near the main trailhead. I saw Cromwell emerge for his oversized SUV, his face already flushed. He strode towards my new signs, followed by a gaggle of confused and increasingly disgruntled-looking Clearview residents in running gear. He ripped one of my smaller paper notices off a tree, scanned it, then bellowed, "What in the blazes is this? Vance, I know you're behind this, Vance." I walked calmly down my driveway and across the road to where he stood, fuming by my new metal sign. Sarah Jenkins, bless her foresight, had arranged to arrive at the same time and was just pulling up. "Mr. Cromwell," I said, my voice even. "Good morning. Lovely day for a run. Though it appears your route may need some adjustment." "Adjustment?" he sputtered, his face turning a shade closer to purple. "You can't do this. These are community trails. We have rights. We've been using these trails for years. This is an outrage." He was practically vibrating with indignation, jabbing a finger at my sign, then at me. "Actually, Mr. Cromwell," Sarah interjected smoothly, stepping forward and handing him a neatly bound document, "you can't. This parcel of land," she gestured to the woods behind the signs, "was sold yesterday. It is now the private property of Vance Heritage Holdings LLC, and they have chosen to restrict access. Here's a copy of the deed, duly recorded with the county." Cromwell snatched the document, his eyes darting over the first page. His jaw, which had been working furiously, slowly went slack. The crowd of runners behind him murmured, a wave of confusion and disappointment rippling through them. Some are looking at Cromwell with dawning suspicion. "Vance Heritage, Holdings, he stammered, the name clearly not registering as me directly, though the Vance part must have been a clue. That's correct, I said. I'm the sole proprietor. These woods are now mine, and they're closed. For a moment, pure, unadulterated fury warred with disbelief on Cromwell's face. You bought it? Just to spite me? To ruin our event? I bought it, Mr. Cromwell, I replied, meeting his gaze squarely, to ensure my peace and quiet, and to protect my property rights from encroachment and baseless accusations. Your HOA fined me $500 for legally hunting on my own ancestral land, claiming it affected your aesthetic enjoyment of trails you didn't own and had no legal right to use or maintain with HOA funds. I simply rectified the ownership situation to prevent any future misunderstandings. I kept my tone level, factual. There was no need for theatrics. The facts themselves were dramatic enough. The crowd was silent now, all eyes on Cromwell. His bluster seemed to deflate like a punctured tire. He looked from me to Sarah to the impenetrable woods, then back to the deed in his hand, as if hoping the words would change. He tried one last rally. There must be an easement, a prescriptive right. We've maintained these trails. Sarah shook her head, a hint of pity in her expression. I'm afraid not, Mr. Cromwell. My firm conducted a thorough title search. There are no recorded easements benefiting Clearview Estates. As for prescriptive rights, your HOA's use was neither hostile in the legal sense of asserting a claim of right against the true owner, nor continuous for the statutory period under a claim of right, especially given Forest Ream Timberlands was an absentee owner unaware of the full extent of your HOA's activities. In fact, she added, her voice hardening slightly, your HOA's expenditure of member funds on property it didn't own or have explicit, recorded permission to improve could be seen as problematic from a governance perspective. That last comment visibly struck home. Several residents in the crowd exchanged uneasy glances. The phrase misuse of funds hung unspoken in the air. Cromwell opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked smaller, somehow his expensive running jacket suddenly seeming ill-fitting. The fight had gone out of him. He knew he was beaten, and more importantly, he knew he'd been made to look like a fool, and potentially a negligent one, in front of his entire community. The fall foliage fund run was, needless to say, canceled. The crowd dispersed in bewildered, angry knots, many of them casting furious looks not at me, but at Cromwell. The carefully constructed facade of his authority had crumbled in a single morning. The fallout was swift and, for Cromwell, brutal. Within a week, an emergency HOA meeting was called, not by him, but by a contingent of furious homeowners. Sarah Jenkins's carefully worded summary of the situation, along with copies of the deed and her analysis of the lack of easements, had circulated widely. The fact that Cromwell had spent thousands of dollars of HOA money maintaining and improving land the HOA had no rights to, while simultaneously harassing a legal landowner, did not sit well. He was subjected to a barrage of questions he couldn't answer, accusations he couldn't refute. His attempts to paint me as the villain fell flat. They now saw him as the architect of their humiliation and the loss of their prized amenity. He resigned as president by the end of the meeting, a defeated man. I heard later from Mrs. Gable, who had an impeccable source within Clearview, that he put his house on the market a month after that and moved away, his reign of petty tyranny unequivocally over. The new HOA board, a far more circumspect and humble group, sent a formal letter apologizing for the actions of their predecessor and rescinding the ridiculous fine. They even tentatively inquired if Vance Heritage Holdings LLC might, in the future, consider granting some form of limited, permitted access to the trails. I sent a polite reply, thanking them for their apology and stating that the land would remain closed for the foreseeable future, dedicated to private enjoyment and conservation. My point had been made. Justice, in this instance, was best served by a firm, unyielding boundary. Vance Woods, and now the adjoining tract, are quieter than ever. I still hunt, still walk the old paths, still find solace in the deep silence of the trees. The only signs now are the ones that state clearly, private property, the memory of my father, and the quiet strength of Eleanor feel very present here. They would, I think, approve. Sometimes, ensuring your peace means you have to be willing to draw a line, not just in the sand, but on a surveyor's map, and back it up with a deed. It's a lesson in boundaries, one that Bartholomew Cromwell and the Clearview Estates HOA learned the hard way. So, that's how a hunting fine led to me buying up the HOA's favorite playground. It just goes to show, doesn't it? Underestimate the quiet ones at your peril, especially when they've got right on their side and a bit of know-how. What are your thoughts on how things turned out? Do you think it was a step too far, or a perfectly measured response to an abuse of power? I'm always interested to hear different perspectives. Thanks for tuning in to my story. If you enjoyed this slice of rural justice, do consider hitting that like button and perhaps subscribe for more tales. It always helps the channel. And remember, stand up for your rights, because sometimes if you don't, no one else will.